Oh, thanks, Kaylee. One of the things that's fun every time I come up here is, we've gotten to lead a lot of different cohorts of connection groups over the years in Ames, and I think there's probably people from half a dozen different versions of that who are here at this church. So I was just talking to Jordan and Emma right before. They were in our living room in Ames last semester. Drew was at one point, Jordan Adams was at one point. So we got all kinds of people who've been really close to us, and so we feel really connected to what God is doing here. And we are I'm just so excited, everything I hear about what God is doing in this church and through this church. I just pray that God continues to do that more and more, because it's exciting, and I hope you guys feel honored to get to be a part of something that God is doing. So what I want us to talk about tonight is how, as Christians, we faithfully represent Jesus with respect to politics as we're living in America in 2023. And let me kind of tell you a little bit about my story and how I approach this. So I have lived a lot of my life moving back and forth between two different worlds, neither of which has a particularly high opinion of the other, right? So I grew up in the Ozarks. So Southwest Missouri is where I grew up, was my first 18 years there. And the Ozarks is a very conservative part of the country. I think the only time a Democrat has ever been elected to Congress was once 100 years ago when somebody else was being thrown in jail. So it's really conservative politically. And I grew up in a politically conservative family. We were Southern Baptist. I grew up, going to vacation Bible school every year. And so some of you are going to connect with this story. Some of you are what on earth are you talking about? But part of my growing up, when I go to vacation Bible school, at the beginning of each day in vacation Bible school, we did pledges. So there would be a pledge to the American flag, there would be a pledge to the Christian flag, and a pledge to the Bible. And we would do all three of these every day in vacation Bible school. And I'm just telling you, as a kid, it never occurred to me that these three things could potentially be in conflict with each other, right? There's just kind of this fusion of nationality, patriotism, Christianity was all kind of one thing. And so I left the Ozarks and I started attending all of these really secular universities. So I went to the University of Chicago first, which is a private school on the south side of Chicago. And I remember getting there and thinking am I the only Christian here? Right? So I've gone from the buckle of the Bible Belt to feeling there's no other Christians even around. It turned out there were a few, but not nearly as many as I was used to. And I had to work to find them a little bit. And that kind of continued as I moved through different stages. So I went from the University of Chicago. I studied in Cambridge, England for a year, getting my master's degree, went to Princeton, got my PhD. And so all of these are places, most people don't think, oh, Ivy League schools, that's where the Christians hang out, right? The stereotype is going to be these are very liberal, progressive, sometimes hostile to Christianity places, and that's where I chose to spend my 20s, right, was in places like that. And so it created these moments, right? So here's one of the more memorable ones. So toward the end of my time at Princeton, I was a teaching assistant for a class called Ethics and Public Policy, and we would talk about all kinds of controversial issues in this topic, in the class. And each week, there would be a meeting with the professor and the other graduate students who were teaching assistants to kind of all be on the same page before we went and led our discussion sections with the undergrads. And this was the week we were getting ready to cover abortion, right? And so at one point, the professor, it was me and half a dozen other grad students, right? She said, just out of curiosity, are any of you pro-life? And I had this moment, it's here we go, right? So I put the hand up, and no other hands went up, and I would have been surprised if one had, right? I mean, mine being the only one, that's exactly the result I was expecting, right, in that moment. And it was this picture, and the professor handled it well, right? But it was one of these reminders that there are certain kinds of things that are almost assumed within a lot of academia that my Christian beliefs kind of put me on the outside with, right? Conversely, You know, when I would talk to people back home about where I was going to school, like that shot me up to the top of the prayer list, right? Because I'm going into like northern godless pagan country, you know, Iowa, you know, that kind of thing, right? Illinois, right? And by the way, I am thankful for that. Anastasia and I talk about it. It's possible that there's some old ladies in Springfield, Missouri who prayed me through college, right? And that's why my faith made it through intact, right? So never turn down prayer, right? But I'm just saying, like, that's the kind of attitude that people would often have toward the two groups. So I've spent a lot of my time trying to learn how to navigate that tension. So as Kaylee was kind of describing, there's a couple of different hats I wear. I've got like a political science professor hat, and I've got like an elder who teaches the Bible hat. So really the only thing that's under my professor hat had to do with that survey I asked you guys to take beforehand. So we're not actually going to talk about the survey the whole weekend. This is part of a little research project I'm working on. I'm trying to figure out, when I do things like this, do people's views change or not change? So the questions aren't even questions that I picked. These are like standard questions that political scientists often ask about religion and politics in America. I'm just trying to kind of get a sense. So if you didn't fill it out, it's okay. If you did, you're going to get an email next week where you're going to basically get a chance to take the same survey again. And it would just be a big favor to me if you actually take the time to do it, because it'll help me with a little research project I'm working on. That's all I'm going to say as a professor. Everything else I'm going to say is going to be me talking to you from my experience as an elder and as someone who loves God's word, to try to understand how we live faithfully, right? So, and I'll tell you at the outset, my goal really is not to try to get you to vote a particular way. That's not what I'm after. I'm wanting to try to figure out, what does faithfulness look like for us as Christians in 2023 as we're trying to navigate the current political landscape. So the text we're going to look at tonight is 1 Peter chapter 2. And we're going to be looking at starting in verse 9 and going through verse 17. 9 through 17. So here's what Peter says. He says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you might proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." So what I want to do is I want to kind of work through this passage, and we got four main topics that we're going to cover. The first, and this is kind of focusing on verses 9 through 11, is understanding our identity of who we are, right? That because of our standing as children of God in the world, we find ourselves sojourners and exiles, right? That's our current situation. Second, we're going to talk about what it means to live honorably among those who don't share your religious views, right? Verse 12. And then from verses 13 to 16, we're going to talk about a Christian understanding of what freedom really is. What does it mean for us as Christians to live as a free people? And then fourth, drawing off of verse 17, we're going to talk about who to honor, who to love, and who to fear, right? So those are going to be our four topics. So let's start off with the first one, understanding our identity as sojourners and exiles. So I don't know if you have ever had the experience of living for an extended period of time in a country where you're not a citizen. I got to experience that. So I spent a year in England when I was in graduate school, living as someone who's not a citizen of England. I was a U.S. citizen, but I was a sojourner, right? I was spending a period of time in a place that's not my home. And there's things that are kind of odd and uncomfortable, right? So for example, there's rhythms to the year marked by major holidays. And you go to another country and you realize just because it's a major holiday in the United States does not mean it's a major holiday everywhere. So like Thanksgiving comes and Thanksgiving goes and English people don't notice, right? Or think about, say, the 4th of July, right? This one's tricky, right? Because you don't normally celebrate the wars you lost, right? The year I was over there, my best friend was another grad student who was also American. And toward the end of our time there, he thought it would be just the greatest thing ever to have a 4th of July party in England, right? And so he's starting to how am I going to pull this off? And so here's the stroke of brilliance that he came up with. Cambridge University, where we were at, was probably 70% international students. There's far more international students than English students. And so what he did is, the other grad students in his college, he sent them an invitation inviting them to his party, and he said, if your country has ever fought a war against England, join us as we celebrate our war against England, right? And everybody came, because it turns out almost every country has fought a war against England at some point. You got the Germans, you got the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, the French, the Italians, right? Basically everybody but the Canadians gets to come, right? And so in that moment, right, he was kind of having fun with the fact that we were sojourners here, right? This isn't our normal home, the normal patterns are disrupted. And we're forced to kind of think about what it actually means to be Americans. What does it mean to be children of God? What does it mean to embrace our identity? Because I think one of the things that's difficult for us as Christians in America sometimes is disentangling what's Christian from what's American. My experience living abroad created a lot of instances where I'm hey, this is different than how we did it back home. But is it wrong, right? Maybe this is actually just a different way of expressing what Christian faith looks like. This is a long time ago. It's more than 20 years ago, I think. Somebody asked one of our pastors at Cornerstone, is Jesus a Republican? And the pastor thought about it and said, wow, I didn't know he was an American. Right? I mean, Jesus is living in Palestine 2,000 years ago. Now, that's not to say we can't try to look at the Bible and try to extrapolate some principles and see how they apply, but the question, right, it's very easy for us to take our contemporary American identities and categories and impose those on the Bible, right? The situation that Paul and Peter are writing about when they're talking about how we interact with ruling authority. So I picked 1 Peter 2, Romans 13 is the other kind of classic passage on this. They're writing to people who are living under the Roman Empire. And he's telling Christians who live under the Roman Empire to live as a free people. So we'll talk more about freedom here in a second. One thing you can figure out is he doesn't mean by a free people who live in a democracy. Because there's not a hint of democracy in the Roman Empire. That's why it's called an empire, right? There's an emperor and you do what he says or you get killed. Right? The emperor, right, around this time is this guy named Nero. And Nero is a guy who just in a few years after they're reading this letter is going to start seriously persecuting Christians. And God, to prepare the Christians to get ready for what's coming, has both Paul and Peter tell them, hey, I want you to help out, submit, right? This is counterintuitive stuff. But it makes sense if we realize that as Christians, we have a new identity that is ultimate for us. Now, the temptation is this, and here's why I'm talking about identity so much. I think that politics can often function as a substitute religion in constituting your identity. And I think it can do that whether you are conservative or a liberal. So let me give an example. So I don't know if you guys have this here in Minneapolis or not, but in Ames, like as I go around town, lots of people have these signs they put in their yard, which are basically like a left-wing creed. You know, like there's the, Apostles' Creed, I believe in, God Almighty, Father, creator of heaven and earth, right? But it's going to be a series of like, we believe in this and this and this and this, and it's a series of like liberal political positions, right? So what are they doing when they put those signs out there, right? They're stating our community is defined by this set of beliefs. Your inclusion in our community depends on your affirming that set of beliefs, right? They're marking out a people who are defined by a set of beliefs. Who does that sound like? I mean, that's a lot of what Christianity is, right? It's a group of people who are identified by a set of beliefs. And I think on the left, you can see a lot of instances where there's people who don't go to church anymore, but their political movement has become a kind of substitute church for them. It provides them a sense of meaning and purpose. It helps them make sense of the universe. It provides them a community that they can be part of. And they even can excommunicate people if they say the wrong thing, right? Say the wrong thing on Twitter and then you're gone, right? It's functioning much like a religious community. Now, on the conservative side, people are less likely to just disavow church and disavow religion. The conservative version of this is a little more subtle. What's more likely to happen is we start merging politics and Christianity to the point where we can't tell where one stops and the other starts. And suddenly, the political lenses have become so powerful that they're so shaping how we read the Bible and how we prioritize what's important in the Bible, that suddenly, our political affiliation becomes central, right? And people are all the time now changing churches mostly because of politics, right? Well, that's telling you a little bit, right, about where people's sense of identity is, right? So as Christians, we are called to remember that we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and we should expect to feel a little uncomfortable and not quite at home here. To be sojourners and exiles is the situation of all Christians everywhere, always, right? And until Jesus comes back, that is going to be how we find ourselves, right? So we have to work to remind ourselves that it is in Christ that we find our true identity, right? As the passage said, in Christ, we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. Once we were not a people, but now by the mercy of God, we are a people. That is who we are, and that is our identity. Okay, so that's our first point. Our second point is about how we live honorably. Remember verse 12, it says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of his visitation. So what I want to try to do is I want to describe 3 different Christian virtues that are examples of how I think we can live honorably among people who don't share our faith. So I want to talk about humility, truthfulness, and love. Let's start with humility. Right? So there's a lot of verses I could quote on humility. Just so you know, there's a kind of a pattern. Humility is pretty much always good in the Bible, and pride is always bad. Spoiler alert there, right? So, for example, Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom, right? So there's this connection between humility and wisdom. And so in politics, here's some ways that I think humility can help us live honorably. First, humility helps us realize the Bible does not always give conclusive answers to our political questions. There's a whole lot of political questions, right, that are getting debated right now, right? And there aren't that many of them where you're going to be able to open up your Bible and know what the law should or shouldn't be. Right? Partly there's 2,000 years difference, right, between when the Bible was written and ours. So a lot of our political questions how should we regulate artificial intelligence? I mean, It's a fair question, but like, you're going to be hard pressed to figure out which Bible verse, right, tells you clearly like which one you're supposed to do. And part of the reason it's difficult, and this is an important point about politics, even when the Bible is clear on a moral point, being clear on the moral point doesn't always settle the political point, right? So not everything that I think is wrong, because the Bible tells me it's wrong, should also be illegal, right? So for example, idolatry is wrong, right? This is like 10 Commandments number 1, right? Idolatry is wrong. You want something the Bible like never wavers on, idolatry is wrong, right? And it's a big deal. Yet, I don't actually think the government should make idolatry illegal, right? Because I don't actually want the government like deciding who is the true God and who's an idol and all that kind of stuff, right? And honestly, given the idol factories the human heart is, if we tried to lock up all the idolaters, there would be no one to run the jail, right? Because all of us have elements of this in us, right? So like there's, you can go all the way back to like the Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas thought how much of virtue the law can command depends a little bit on the virtue of the people you're trying to legislate for, and it varies, right? So in other words, like even if we agree, and I think we should agree, that the Bible is clear that marriage is supposed to be between a man and a woman, right? That's the biblical understanding of marriage. What do you do when a huge percentage of the population doesn't think that way anymore, right? How should the law work when the moral consensus on that has broken down? I'm not sure, right? But the point I'm wanting to say is, however you come down on that, and you may have a strong opinion on it, realize that question, which of those moral principles we believe the Bible teaches should also be legislated for non-Christians. It's fairly rare, right, for the Bible to definitively answer that. And so we're having to use wisdom and judgment to do the best we can. But if we're using wisdom and judgment, we could admit that Christians may sometimes disagree about these things, right? And we can show some grace to people who think about things a little differently. And that leads into my second point about humility. No one political party perfectly captures a kingdom perspective. There's a whole lot of issues that we could talk about from the Bible. And political parties are not designed to be faithful interpreters of the Word of God. Political parties exist to win elections. That's their function. So what they're going to do is they're going to figure out which issues they think making a big deal out of wins them more votes, right? And so if you want to think about like which issues have become the most salient in our culture, it's not necessarily because those are the issues that are most important to God. It is sometimes because one or the other political party has decided if we make a big deal out of this issue, we think that gets votes for us. So here's an example that I have used a lot over the years. In the book of Proverbs is very clear that when a rich person and a poor person appear in court, they should be treated the same. Right? You shouldn't have an easier time in court because you're wealthy. I sometimes then ask people, how many people actually think that's true in the United States? Like if you're a millionaire and you're dirt poor, like you got two people and they're both arrested, do you think they have like equal chances of ending up in prison if one's really rich and the other's really poor? Most people I talk to say, no. Like the rich guy who could hire all the expensive lawyers and all that kind of stuff, could still get convicted, but has a way better chance than the poor person, right? And then I ask myself, okay, for the last 30 years, as I've been following politics, which political party has made a big issue of that? Nobody, because neither party thought making a big deal of that was going to win them any more votes, right? So as Christians, we have to realize political parties at some level exist to manipulate us. That's just part of democracy at some level, right? It kind of goes with the territory. But as Christians, we have to realize like neither of them is going to be giving us a perfectly balanced and accurate view of how God sees the world. And we're going to have to use discernment as we try to think that through. And show grace for other Christians who, as they're wrestling through that, come down in a different place. Now, I am not saying you have to look at the two political parties and believe they are equal, right? My hunch is, I'm not going to do it. We could do an experiment, okay, if you think the Republicans are closer, go over here, Democrats are over. We could see how the room divvies up. So you're allowed to have an opinion about which party is closer to the truth, right? But humility is recognizing that both of them fall short, and it's difficult sometimes knowing how we weigh these things against each other. And then third, I think part of humility is remembering that we are not better than other people, right? What we have in common with them is we are all image bearers, right? We are all created in the image of God, and there's a respect and honor that is due to every single human being we meet, irrespective of what their political party is, simply because they, like us, are image bearers. That's humility. So the second one I want to talk about is truthfulness. So in the Ten Commandments, commandment number 9, this is Exodus 20, verse 16, says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." Right? Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. So here's another observation about politics. Imagine we've got two politicians up here who are competing for the same office, they're running against each other. The first one gets up to speak and starts describing, all the stuff his opponent stands for and how terrible it is. Sits down, the other person comes up and then says, "I want to thank you for fairly explaining to them what my positions actually are. I understand that you disagree with them, but I really appreciate the fact that what you said my position was is an accurate representation of what I really think." Have you ever seen that in politics once? Right? Have you ever watched a television commercial for a politician and gotten to the end, it's now I have a fair, clear, picture of what the other guy really stands for? No, politics is constantly people taking quotations out of context to make the other person look worse than they really are, finding the most ugly, unflattering picture of the other person to post up, right? Sometimes just flat making stuff up, right, that they didn't really say. That's bearing false witness. So when, tomorrow I get to talk more about how I navigate stuff as a teacher at a secular university. But one of the things that I really try to encourage is to say, when you state your opponent's position, state your position, when you're summarizing their position, summarize it in a way that if they were standing right next to you, they would say, "Yes, that's what I think." Nobody does that in our culture anymore. Almost nobody. Christians should be the people who are known for doing that. And it is frustrating to me how quick Christians are to see something on social media that agrees with their preconceived political notions and like it, retweet it, broadcast it on with zero knowledge of whether it's actually true or not. Right? Because a lot of the stuff that's in your feed isn't actually true. And if you're going around promoting it to other people, you're now participating in bearing false witness. I'll just say I'm personally of the opinion that social media is a pretty terrible way to have political discourse. I don't think it brings out the best in us, and it doesn't seem very well suited at all to actually respectfully listening to and articulating the views of others. I'll just say be careful in how you participate in social media so that you're not involved in bearing false witness against other people. I think it would be radical if Christians became known as the people in our culture who actually did this. Because if you started doing this, it'll be counterintuitive and countercultural, right, for a lot of people. Okay, third, love. Third part of living honorably, I think, is love. Jesus says that the greatest commandments are to love God with our whole being and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think one of the things that is striking about modern American politics is both on the left and on the right, how much of it is driven by this like toxic mix of fear and anger. People are really afraid of what happens if the other side wins. And that fear is used to stoke anger, right, toward the other side. And the reason they do it is fear and anger are actually pretty good motivators, right? If you're trying to get people to show up at the polls, fear and anger actually do pretty well. But as Christians, we are called to love our enemies, right? So even if you think the other side winning leads to them persecuting you, love them, right? And if you're looking at 2 Peter, notice it's not just like have kind, affectionate thoughts. It's like, no, actually do tangible acts of love to serve other people. Right? So for example, it says, when they speak against you as evildoers, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of his visitation. Like, so there's like actual things we're doing as acts of love that people can see that are actually silencing them. If somebody says something about politics that you don't like on social media and you respond, the one thing I can tell you your post will not do is silence the debate, right? It just keeps going. It keeps going. And no matter how right you are, somebody will disagree with you, right? You know what really does silence people though sometimes? Like if we act in radically loving ways that seem like contrary to their preconceptions of what Christians are supposed to be like, that makes people stop and think. That makes people stop and think. So here's an example. If I had a time machine and I could go back to the 80s and 90s, like, so this is like when I was in my teens and 20s, and I could make a plea to the evangelical churches I grew up in, it would be this. Could we as Christians be the people who are known for standing up against bullying and harassment, even if the bullying and harassment is directed toward people who are gay or lesbian? That doesn't mean we're saying we think it's okay. It doesn't mean we're saying like we agree with this, like as what the Bible teaches about sex. I'm saying like even if they're practicing sexuality differently than the way the Bible teaches, they still shouldn't be beat up. They shouldn't be like verbally abused. I mean, like when I look back at some of the stuff I saw, like in high school, there's this awful treatment of people on the basis of their sexual orientation, and the people who were the bullies were normally people who would have identified as Christians. Like, what if back in the 80s and 90s, without changing our beliefs about right and wrong, Christians had been people who actually did acts of love to stand up for people who were being bullied? I think our current culture would look so different we can't even imagine it right now, right? That was a missed opportunity. So the question is, we missed that one. What are the opportunities we still have now to look for opportunities in line with our values to do acts of good, even for people who may disagree with us? Okay, so that's the second point, to live honorably among those who don't share our views. The third thing I want to talk about is a Christian view of freedom. So now go to verse 13, right? It says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Okay, so there's a picture of freedom in this passage that is very different than the way our culture thinks about freedom. Because somehow, in Peter's mind, submitting to the authority of the emperor and living as the free people of God go together, right? So submission to authority and freedom somehow work together. And ultimately, right, we're told not to misuse our freedom, because true freedom is living according to God's design and God's plan. So here's how I'd explain it, right? I think in our culture, the dominant view of freedom is doing whatever you want. Like, if you can tell me what to do, then I'm not free. If I have to submit and I'm under your authority, then I'm not free. So freedom is the ability to do whatever it is I want to do. And then if we says, well, okay, there have to be a few limits, right? And so maybe we need to nuance that a little bit by saying, I'm free to do whatever I want as long as I don't harm anyone else. But now we've got to figure out what counts as harming somebody else. And normally in our culture, the way we define what counts as harming someone else, again, puts like individual choice at the center, because we say anything people consent to doesn't count as harm. You follow that? Right? If you consent, there's no harm, and therefore you should be able to do whatever you want, right? So we're kind of using individual choice, like on both ends, as a way of defining what freedom is. And I think that dominant view of freedom is just pervasive in American culture. It's been around for a long time. It's been around longer than the culture war stuff. And a lot of what we experience in the culture war is just people taking that view of freedom that we've had for a long time in this country and just working out its implications. So as Christians, we have a different view of freedom, right? Our view is freedom is living out the identity that God has given us. Freedom is living out the identity that God has given us. And so when we submit to God's law and we walk in the paths God has designed, we are more free than when we choose our own way and we end up becoming enslaved to sin. Right? So this is the paradox. The Bible teaches that submission to God is the path to freedom. Now, this is counterintuitive, right? But this is what Peter is talking about when he says, don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil, because freedom is supposed to be in line with God's purposes. So let me give an illustration. In Ames, where I live in Iowa, university has this really nice cross-country track. And back when I was younger, I used to run. And it's this beautiful track. It's like these, it's wide, lush green grass. You're like going up and down hills. There's like trees on either side of you. It's beautiful, right? So here's the question. As I'm running along that path, there's a boundary to the path, right? There's the trees and the weeds and everything, right, that show me the boundaries of the running path. Do those barriers take away my freedom? And my answer is it all depends on whether I have embraced the identity I'm a runner. Because if I'm a runner, what I want to do is run, and the running is best if I stay on the path. If I want to run and I start running into the woods, now I'm like dodging trees and like jumping over small animals and all this kind of stuff, right? The running is worse. Like, I've never seen someone who is really a runner on the path just suddenly veer off into the woods, right? Because they're trying to, they've embraced the idea, I am a runner. And so in running, they're being who they are. Okay, now imagine somebody else visits that same cross-country track, but their identity is not, I'm a runner. Their identity is, I am a bug collector. I have a feeling that the nice grass that I run on is really boring for a bug collector compared to all the interesting stuff in the woods. Now, all of a sudden, if there's a barrier that says stay on the path, that sign feels like an affront to my freedom, right? Because what I want to do to express my freedom is to go where the bugs are, right? So the point is you can have two people who see the same stay on the path sign and have completely different reactions to it. One person embraces it because they realize it's helping them be who they really are, the other person's going to see it as a restriction on their liberty. So here's how this applies to us as Christians. The more we have embraced our identity in Jesus Christ, the more we realize that we were built to run in the path of God's commands, to use the language of Psalm 119, right? And as we run in the path of God's commands, we experience freedom, and we start realizing that a lot of these things we do that we think are expressing our true self are actually just allowing sin to get a stronger and stronger hold of us, right? I mean, think of just the epic of pornography addiction we have in the United States right now. It's enormous. And at one level, you can say, like, I'm free because I can watch whatever I want to watch, right? But then having done that, you may find yourself not feeling quite as free as you thought you would to quit watching it, right? And we can go through substance abuse. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Even the pursuit of like achievement and success can actually become things that enslave us, right? And so as Christians, we have a message, I think, to bring to our culture that involves a deeper view of what true freedom is, right? So our culture may say, adultery leading to divorce is fine as long as everyone consents, right? Because they've kind of defined harm as whatever people consent to. But I don't know very many people who actually think when someone commits adultery and then divorces their spouse, that the spouse isn't harmed, right? They didn't consent to all that, right? The reality is, many of the most valuable things in life involve limiting our options, right? The whole institution of marriage involves giving up the freedom to be with whoever you want to be, but you gain something in losing something, right? You gain a type of relationship that is only possible when people have made a lifelong commitment to each other that is unconditional. And so as Christians, we need to be interacting with our culture at this deepest level, because I think ultimately our culture's way of talking about freedom is going to bankrupt itself. It's hollow, right? The modern understanding of freedom leads to a view of romantic relationships where, like, you imagine two people who are like, going through a marriage ceremony, but they're actually going to say what they really mean, right? And they say something like, I promise that I will break up with you first if I meet someone I like better. Right? In our culture, can you promise anything more than that? If you're going to make whatever your future self wants the most the highest goal and the highest priority. You can't, right? But some of us realize if that's all people can promise to each other, something valuable has just been lost, right? And as Christians, we can speak to that. So the reason I'm spending as much time on this as I am is I think one of the ways Christians have struggled politically over the last few decades is we failed to realize that what I just described is a wrong view of freedom that cuts across our entire society and is true not just of how people who are in the LGBTQ movement think, but how actually a very large percentage of heterosexual Americans think. And instead of helping us see how the whole culture was going off the rails, we've often selectively picked a few groups that have bought into that philosophy, and we just go after those few groups rather than talking about the larger issue. And I think when we've done that, we end up coming across as bullies, right? Because it seems like here's a group that's already been harassed and marginalized, and we're going to pile on more. You don't have to agree with me on this, but I honestly believe the greatest threat to the institution of marriage in the United States today is not people who have a same-sex orientation. The greatest threat to the institution of marriage in America today is a view of freedom that is held by all Americans, whether they're heterosexual or not, right? And so as Christians, if we can start engaging in the larger culture, it quits being as much of a us against them kind of thing, And people are going to now see that Christianity has a radical critique, not just of particular groups, but a radical critique of our whole culture. Okay. And I'll also just mention, when it says submit to the governing authorities, that means submit to the governing authorities. And you may say, but wait, what if we don't have a fair election? Well, you know what? We might not have a fair election. Back in the first century, they didn't get any elections. There were like exactly 0 elections. If you went up to Nero and said, I think we should have an election, you would be dead, right? The mere idea of it. So I'm saying like, and I don't care if you're a liberal who thinks the conservatives cheated through voter suppression, or you're a conservative who thinks the liberals cheated because they're like rigging votes somehow, right? As Christians, we need to be characterized as people, as was true then, who are willing to submit to the governing authorities that have been placed over us. Okay, last point. Who to honor, who to love, and who to fear. Look at verse 17. It says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Right, so I would just say, honor everyone, that first command, that is a radical claim. That means honor your enemies. That means honor people who you think are out to get you and people who are of your group. Honor everyone is again a reminder that every human being we meet is an image bearer and is entitled to respect. And this should be the end, by the way, like there is so much in our society of people acting badly, and then when someone calls it on it, point to how the other side acted badly first, right? As Christians, that's not what it looks like to live honorably. Like, honor everyone means they don't have to act honorably first. We act honorably first, right? And treat others with honor. Then it says, after honor everyone, love the brotherhood. That means like love your Christian family, your brothers and sisters in Christ. And again, in a culture that is becoming increasingly polarized in its politics, the tendency in our culture right now seems to be like people dividing up into warring tribes and having as little to do with each other as possible, right? You know, like there's the liberal sports network or the conservative sports network, you know, like eating Chick-fil-A is like a political statement now, right? Shouldn't be, but in the kind of culture like we live in, it is. And so increasingly, you know, if I'm a Democrat, I move to a blue state where I can live next to blue people and eat in blue restaurants, right, and have as little to do, and vice versa. And that attitude, I'm telling you, has been ripping apart American churches. Love the brotherhood means love your brothers and sisters in Christ, irrespective of whether you agree with their politics or not. Right? Because what we have in common in the blood of Jesus Christ is far more important than political divisions. Love our Christian family. By the way, let me say this in a positive note. The most angry, polarized voices in our culture are the ones that get the most attention, right? And they have a vested interest and sometimes a profit motive at just keeping the anger stirred up as much as possible. And like those are the voices that get amplified on social media. But I think there is a huge percentage of Americans that are already just tired of it. They're tired of the division. They're tired of that. If the church, think about this, what if the church became the one place left in our culture where people who disagreed with each other about politics actually came together, cooperated, and worked for a common cause? I think there's a lot of people who are not coming to church right now who would actually be intrigued by that. It could be something that God could draw them in. And then we might think, wow, Jesus was onto that something when he's like, they will know you by your love, right? Right? This is something that can be attractive to those who are outside the church. Then it says, fear God. 2 words, fear God, right? But this is crucial. I've been talking about loving others in times when it's hard, right? These are not, there's like easy, like loving my mom is easy. My mom is awesome and she's always loved me my whole life. That's an easy one, right? Loving people who don't love me is much harder. But it's easier if we fear God. Because here's the thing, if we fear God rather than fearing human beings, we remember the worst the government could do to us is kill us. And that just means we see Jesus sooner, right? It's actually not something to be afraid of, right? They could heap shame on us for a few years, and then we're in heaven for eternity, right? Like the more we fear God, the less we have to fear people, and the less we fear people, the easier it is to actually love as Jesus has called us to love. And then finally, it says honor the king, right? And I already talked about this, right? Even if you think the elections weren't fair, for whatever reason, right? But I think it's interesting. He already said honor everyone. So you would think like, well, surely the king or the emperor, right? That's part of everyone. I think it's restated for emphasis because it is hard to do when we are often surrounded by people who are encouraging us to do the opposite, right? But as Christians, that's what we are called to do. Okay, so what I want to do now is stop, and I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions. So I don't think we have mics out there, so just try to project, and then I will try to state back your questions so that if people didn't hear, they're able to hear. So what questions do you guys have about any of this? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It wants to go save and protect people around the world from oppressive regimes. As a Christian, if it's some other place in the world that's being oppressed by a terrible government, a terrible leader,
Mm-hmm.
is it better to say we will aid them by trying to protect them and disarming that oppressive leader?
Mm-hmm.
Or do we say follow Christ and submit to that back?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was, if Christians were supposed to submit to Nero, right, even though there was going to be this oppressive regime, how do we think about people around the world who live under oppressive regimes? And as the United States, should we be going around trying to release those people? Like, we could launch an invasion to try to topple an unjust government. There's various things we could do. Should we be doing that? Or should we be telling them to submit, right? So that's a really good question, and a really good answer would probably be longer than everybody else here wants to hear. But I'll try to say a few things that would be helpful. So one thing I would say is I've sometimes thought in terms of the Nero test. So during World War II, there was a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer who ends up being thrown in jail because his family was assisting in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And as near as we can tell, I think they were, and he was involved to some degree. So I can look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer and say, shouldn't you just be submitting to the authorities? I mean, the authorities, we're talking about actual Hitler here, right? Who's like committing genocide and things like that. So one of the ways I've thought about this is I want to give Dietrich Bonhoeffer a little slack because I think Hitler actually was worse than Nero. Maybe there's extreme cases where the most loving thing a Christian could do would be to take arms to try to overthrow, but we need to be really cautious about going there, and a lot of the times when we've done this have been instances that fall pretty far short of the Nero test. And even then, I think you could maybe make the argument, even then you're still not supposed to. When you start talking about other countries, there's a Christian tradition of just war theory. So, obviously there have been some Christians over the years who are pacifists and believe you just never use violence at all. There's a different Christian tradition that says under certain circumstances, you're allowed to use force or violence. And St. Augustine's way of putting it would be, you can only do it, one, if you have rightful authority. Second, if you have a just cause. Like there has to be an injustice that's been done that you're trying to remedy. And third, you have to have a right intention, which means your motive actually needs to be trying to restore peace and justice rather than just like expand your power and get rich, right? So all of those things would have to be met. So if you take that line of thinking, another government is not actually in the same position as the citizens under a government, right? The citizens under a government have an obligation to obey those that have been placed over them, but other entities haven't. I mean, it's not a perfect example, but one way of understanding what a police officer is doing when a police officer uses force is there's been some Christians who've said, I don't have the right to defend myself, but a third party has the right to come in and defend me, right? So in other words, the police officer who comes and stops the person from beating me up may be doing exactly what God would want a police officer to do, right? So some people will try to draw that kind of an analogy such that, and by the way, I guess my own view would be, I don't think I would let the lack of democracy alone be the reason for launching a war. Right, and it's partly passages like this make it seem like democracy isn't actually the most important thing. There are other ways of just acting unjustly that could reach a point, we're talking about like rampant human rights violations, genocide, kinds of things like that. It could actually be the right thing, I think, for other countries to try to intervene in the name of justice to try to stop it. But whether we should in any particular case is going to require a lot of wisdom. And in part, wisdom thinking through what precedent is this going to set for future international conflicts, thinking through the likelihood of success, how much collateral damage, how long, how expensive. I mean, there's all those things that actually I think are relevant things. So personally, I tend to err on the side of caution, and I tend to be reluctant to just send in the troops to fix things. Often sending in the troops hasn't fixed things as well as we thought it was going to. But I don't think there's a clear biblical answer that says it would always be wrong either. And believe it or not, that was the short version of the answer. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're disqualified. We should eradicate Jews. We should disqualify them for consideration.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, today we have millions of people being aborted and I'm just curious how Christians think about that in their qualification, who they can in good conscience.
Right.
And of course, at different levels.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, so the question is, are there certain views that are just so unjust that they should disqualify a person from holding office? And so as Christians, should we think support for abortion is an example of one of those positions that just has to be off the table? So I think what I would say is, I think this is a question that Christians can reasonably disagree about. So I certainly know and have a lot of Christian friends of mine who have come to exactly that conclusion. They have said, given the enormity of injustices that are taking place against the unborn, for me to support a candidate who endorses that is just something that I can't in good conscience do, right? And so that means, practically speaking, either they vote Republican or they vote a third party or something, but most of the time that means they're not going to be willing to vote for a Democrat. And so, I mean, I think that's a reasonable position a Christian could come to, and I know a lot of people who have. If I were going to explain why I don't think like we can be certain Christians have to come to that conclusion, one would be we could end up in a situation where like I look at both candidates and what if I feel like both of them are disqualified, right? You know, so I'll give you a hypothetical. Suppose someone thinks that Joe Biden's positions on abortion are unconscionable and thinks that Donald Trump's character is simply unfit for the White House, right? And both are like disqualifying. Like, what do I do? Now, so here's the kind of unspoken assumption, and this is part of why I think people can disagree about it. So a lot of it depends on what you think casting a vote for person X means. And there's different ways of interpreting what a vote is. So one way of interpreting what a vote is saying like, if I vote for this person, I am endorsing everything they stand for. And so there's certain positions, if they hold them, I can't do that because it would mean I am endorsing that thing, right? And so I will say personally for me, I would just end up not voting a lot, right, if I took that, because I often find myself in situations where I feel that way about both candidates, right? There's certain things that I would not want to identify myself with in voting for that person. Yeah, obviously it depends, and different people are going to come down on that different ways. Here's a different way of thinking about what you're doing when you're voting. A different way of thinking about what you're doing in voting is saying, in a democracy set up the way ours is in the United States, and by the way, you know, we could have a whole little conversation, like democracies can be structured differently, and I'll say this, like part of me actually wishes, for these reasons, our voting system worked more like it does in some European countries where they do proportional representation, and you can vote for a third or fourth party and not feel like you just wasted your vote. Because now suddenly you start getting more options and your chances of finding someone who really comes pretty close to identifying with your beliefs goes way up. For better or for worse, the way the US system was set up, finishing second gets you nothing. Finishing first gets you everything. And so anytime there are three parties, there is a huge pressure for the two smaller ones to combine so they have a chance at beating the other one. And so that's part of the reason why we've never been able to make a stable third-party thing work for any length of time in the United States. So given our rules that basically give us a choice between two parties, a different way of understanding a vote is simply to say, I'm going to choose to vote, you know, the better of two goods or the lesser of two evils, depending on what I'm faced with. And so in calling them the lesser of two evils, I might want to acknowledge there is some evil in what I just voted for, but I voted for it because it seemed like a lesser evil than the evil on the other side, right? And now you start getting to how you weigh things. I'll say one other thing, and this is more specifically on abortion itself, because abortion has been the most significant issue for evangelicals in politics, I think, for the last 30-some years. So I'm pro-life, and so a candidate being pro-life always counts as a plus for me, and a candidate being pro-choice always counts as a minus for me. But I've chosen personally not to be a single issue voter, and part of the reason is not all candidates and not all offices are equally in a position to actually be able to influence abortion policy, or if they do, influence it that much. So for example, you know, if I'm voting for like state auditor, it may not really matter that much whether the person's pro-life or pro-choice, because their job doesn't actually involve that. So when you're voting for a president of the United States, you know, I've been saying this for years, and now it will strike people differently after Roe v. Wade was actually overturned, right? But I want you to go like back in a little time machine with me. Imagine we're back in the many years before that. First, I vote for a president who says he's pro-life. Then I have to hope he actually turns out to be pro-life once he's in office, because you never quite know what they're going to do and how important it's going to be once they win. then we have to hope that the person he puts on the Supreme Court, who they think is pro-life, actually turns out to vote pro-life once they get there, right? You start, and then if all of that goes right and Roe v. Wade gets overturned, now we have to hope there's enough anti-abortion sentiment at the state level to actually get legislation passed, right? So there's just a whole bunch of different steps. So what I would say is, in general, when you're voting for a president, their ability to control how many abortions happen in the United States is more limited than you think. On other issues like war and foreign policy or immigration, they actually have a lot more power, right, on some of those kinds of issues. So I tend to weight an issue based on how much influence I think that person is likely to have on the issue. That's part of my calculation. I can't remember what it was. I saw something just in the last month or two that was estimating that since Roe versus Wade was overturned, the number of abortions in the United States has gone down about like 7%. So like, if people thought overturning the decision was going to mean like the end of abortion in America, it's made a small dent in it. But part of my takeaway from this is, I think the most crucial pro-life agenda item needs to be persuading more people that abortion is wrong. Like, you can get all the Supreme Court justices you want. If they don't think it's wrong, one, they're not going to vote to restrict it at the state level. But even more so, in an era where it is so easy to mail an abortion pill to somebody, even if they live in a red state that's gotten rid of it, we need to be doing everything we can to persuade people at the individual level to make the choice for life, because this is God honoring and it's honoring the image of God. And that's not to say we shouldn't also work at other levels. Like I said, I would like to have pro-life legislation in place, right? I think it's good for legislation to seek justice, and that often means protecting the weak and the vulnerable. And I would say the unborn are like textbook weak and vulnerable, right, who deserve the protection of the law. So I support that, but I also think maybe as Christians, we put so much emphasis on a political solution to the problem that sometimes undermine our ability to actually win hearts and minds over to it. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
What are your opinions on Christian theocracy, and whether you see foundation for that in Scripture, and then even thinking if you could supplant 12 Christian pastors to run the country,
Right.
would that be a better system? And then even maybe bigger, saying what are your views on democracy, monarchy, other forms of theocracy?
Yeah. That's good. So the question is what do I think about theocracy? And theocracy is something viable today. So theocracy would be rule by God, or those God has entrusted, to rule in his stead. My answer would be no. I would want to stay away from theocracy. And my reasoning would be this. So in the Old Testament, ancient Israel was a theocracy, in the literal sense. So, in the book of Judges, they don't have a king, and that wasn't because God forgot. The original plan was that God would be their king, right? And the judges were just to help out every now and then when things got off track, but the norm was supposed to be God as their king, right? And so this is why, if you think about how the story goes in the book of 1 Samuel, when the people start demanding a king like the other nations, and Samuel is really upset about it, God says, give them what they want. They are not rejecting you, Samuel. They are rejecting me as their king, and I'm going to let them reject me. It's this really interesting passage, right? We could talk about that one for a long time. But Israel functioned as a theocracy in a unique way. And I don't think any modern state has that same link to God that Israel did. So I would say like the modern parallel to Israel is not the United States of America. The modern parallel to Israel is the Church of Jesus Christ. But the Church of Jesus Christ isn't a state, right? We don't bear the sword and go around like, enforcing justice. And so I think that sort of thing is exactly what 1 Peter 2 that I was reading is trying to push against. Reminding us that we are sojourners and exiles while we're here on earth is a way of saying, get used to having people who are not like you in political authority over you. But the good news is it's only for a short time and we get eternity with Jesus, right? So your other question was about like monarchy versus like democracy and different forms of government. My view would be we are going to spend eternity in a monarchy. Like Jesus is not going to have to run for election, right? I mean, when we're in the new heavens and the new earth, he is King of kings and Lord of lords. And he doesn't have to answer to us. And to live under a king like Jesus is the best system of government anyone could possibly have. But this side of heaven, monarchy has a lot of problems. Democracy does too, right? I'm probably a little bit of the, democracy is the worst form of government except all the others kind of view, right? It has troubles, but like you start looking at the other alternatives, they have troubles too. So I would say in a fallen world, democracy has some advantages for how we can try to use it to put a check on those who are in positions of authority so that they're more likely to use their authority for the public good. By the way, I'll say this is like a general pattern in Scripture that instead of teaching that authority is bad, the Bible teaches that authority is good and that authority's intended purpose is to be a blessing to those who are under authority. So when those who are in authority use that authority for their own good and to harm those who are underneath them, that's a misuse of authority, and that's contrary to what God's design is, right? So that means, elders should be leading the church for the good of the church, not for the good of the elders, right? Political leaders should be using their authority for the public good, not for their own benefit, right? Husbands lead their wives for the wife's good, not just to make the husband's life easier, right? So all the way along, like this is, I think, the consistent pattern, right? Authority, we do better, like sometimes in our culture, we think if there could be no authority, life would be better. And I think in the biblical worldview, authority is a good thing. It can be a blessing. But for it to be what it's intended to be, it should be used for the good of others. So Jesus never has a problem with that, right? Human rulers do. And so democracy can provide some incentives for human rulers to use their authority for the public good. Yeah.
Yeah, so earlier you mentioned things like the two parties do what they do because they
Right.
think it will be something that gets them.
Yeah.
If it was you, what would you say? Here are some issues that I think that should be at the top of the list, regardless of how that would impact people's
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I do find difficult about, I think a problem democracies seem to have had for the last 50 to 100 years, is a persistent tendency to spend more money than they take in, right? And to run up bigger and bigger debts. And the Republicans will occasionally pretend to care about it, but it doesn't ever, even on the Republican side, it doesn't ever seem to stop them from wanting to spend more on defense, cut taxes, right? And so, if you look at the general pattern, we just keep running up more and more debt, whether it's Republicans or Democrats in office. And at some point, I think that's going to be unsustainable. So I think that would be one issue. I would like it if we could, figure out some ways, may make a bunch of people mad here. You ask me these kinds of questions, but I think there's enough evidence that climate change is real that it's worth taking preventative measures. Like if there's even like a 1 in 3 chance it's true, like you would take out an insurance policy, right, for something that even is like a 1 in 3 chance that it's real. So I would love it if we could figure out some ways to make things like that less of a partisan, polarizing issue where the two parties are often like dueling against each other just to win like debating points that appeal to the base, and see if there's like some compromise things we could do to try to work together on that. Yeah, we could go on for a long time, but I mean, just for me personally, those would be a couple of things. Yeah.
As a young man, this generation, I've kind of been entertained by politics in the last couple of years. And I've
Yeah.
noticed how polarizing it's been since I was 18. Now, the past couple of years, I've noticed it's been even more polarizing. Where do you see that heading in the sense of people attacking each other based on emotions? And I guess talking about freedom, we're talking about today.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And here's one thing I should say, for my day job, I am a political scientist, but mostly what I do is I read ancient political philosophy from hundreds of years ago and then think about what it might mean for today. I'm about as far from someone who can make good predictions about what's going to happen in the real world as you're going to find. And my track record is terrible. So just I have I don't have a good track record of being able to predict the political future. What I can say, let me actually start by, you're asking there's this trend toward polarization. Where do we see that headed? I guess what I would say is it's happened before. I think the polarization we have in the United States right now is the worst it's been in my lifetime. I was born in the early 1970s. But I'm not sure it's worse than it was in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there's riots, there's mass protests with the civil rights movement, there's all the protests against the Vietnam War, there's this huge generational divide going on. That was really bad. I don't know if we're worse than that yet. We might be. We might be getting close. If I go back 100 years before that, we were even more divided in the Civil War. We actually had a war, right? So when people say it's never been this divided before, it's no, America in the 1850s. If you could visit America in the 1850s, members of Congress were actually getting into fights with each other, in the Capitol. So things have been bad before, but I don't think you're imagining things. I think things really have been getting more polarized, especially the last decade or so. Where do I see that going? I don't know. I can imagine two things, right? It could be it just spirals down to a point where there is so little shared trust that democracy just quits working. That's scary, right? Another possibility is these things are a little bit like pendulums, and at a certain point, people get tired and worn out of it and say, this is enough. Or something happens that gets us close enough to the brink where people oh no, this is not healthy, right? And we consciously start moving things back the other direction. That's my hope, right? Is that, at a certain point, things get sufficiently frustrating and scary, right? That people have had enough and the pendulum starts swinging back the direction. But I guess what I would say is I don't think the Bible gives us any guarantees on this. And this is, I'll say this part of my experience as someone who, has studied the history of political thinking and all that. Empires rise and empires fall. Every empire that's ever existed has always fallen. Just give it enough time. The United States will too at some point if Jesus doesn't come back first, right? This is how the world tends to work. If you'd visited, Europe in 1400, you would assume monarchy is the only viable form of government because that's what everything was, right? You visit, in the middle of the 1900s, you think democracy must be what everything is going to. Who knows, right? There's no guarantee that the age of democracy lasts forever either, right? And I think the Bible doesn't promise us a particular political outcome. And so knowing that, it both reminds us why it's so important to have our sense of self and identity rooted in who we are in Christ, because that actually is something we can count on, right? As opposed to, if my identity is wrapped up in America being the greatest, that's actually a scary thing to have your identity wrapped on, because maybe someday it won't be, right? But if your identity is wrapped up in who you are in Jesus Christ, you have something the world can never take from you. But then conversely, it means as Christians, part of doing good and performing acts of love is we should be doing what we can to help this country stick together, right? And not slide off the cliff, right? And so that hopefully can help motivate us to do what we can to be agents of love and peace. Yeah.
Now, we told the line of, you kind of mentioned that, like, political parties are not fully truthful.
Yeah.
The line of, we don't know everything that's going on without being a conspiracy theorist.
Okay, say the last part again.
We told the line between, like, knowing that we're not getting the full and not being a conspiracy theorist.
Right. Yeah, so the question is, given that political parties don't always tell the truth and they can manipulate, how do we toe the line between knowing what we don't know, getting into conspiracy theories? There's a variety of different ways we could come down. So I guess what I would say is, well, one, by the way, I want to emphasize something I maybe didn't emphasize enough before. In saying that political parties are often manipulating to win votes, in a democracy, they're just part of the game. And I'm not saying that Christians can't be involved in politics or be active in a political party because they're fallen. It comes actually back to my answer to you. I think you can say, look, in a fallen world, even though the political parties aren't perfect, if Christians completely opt out of politics, we're missing out on an opportunity to show love for our neighbor by doing that well and with integrity. Right? So I think Christians, even though there's manipulation, all those things, I think Christians can still do the best they can to try to enter those spaces and act with integrity. And by the way, come back tomorrow morning and we'll talk about this more, right? In terms of navigating, our careers in a fallen world. The other thing I would say is having a general principle where you try to, with an open mind, get news and opinions from people who are on both sides of an issue can help you, I think, get a little closer to the truth than if you only are getting information from one side or from the other side, right? So it's not a perfect analogy, but if I'm in a jury and I've got two lawyers and one of them's trying to convince me that the guy is guilty and another is trying to convince me that the guy is innocent, and I know neither attorney is being impartial, right? Both of them have an agenda. But since I know both of them have an agenda, that kind of gives me a filter through which to take in the information and try to weigh both of them the best I can. And so I think that's kind of the encouragement I would give people is, make a point of trying to get some information from sources that you might disagree with and go into it with an open mind thinking there could be some things that reading this is going to help me see that I wasn't getting from the stream I was reading previously. Yeah.
As Christians, what can be a bigger challenge for us is not the people who really oppose us, it's the people who mostly agree with us. But like you were saying, more than politics becoming their religion, how do we engage with Christians who have put politics first and put Jesus on the backs of the messengers?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. The question is, what do we do if it's not somebody who's completely opposed to us? It may be someone who, in large measure, actually agrees with us, but politics has now become their center of identity and the focus of their world in a way that is superseding the gospel. How do I interact with that person? And I guess what I would say is it depends a lot on what your relationship with that person is. Actually, we were just talking about this topic in my connection group 2 nights ago. And, I was one of the people in the connection group was describing like interactions with a parent, who like really, likes to do some of this, right? Where all they want to do is talk about politics all the time and get really agitated if you don't agree with everything they say. And in that particular instance, when I was talking to this college student, I said, I know of very few people who've told me the story about how they lectured their parents on politics and the parent like changed their mind. And like, in general, parents don't like being lectured by their kids about religion, about politics, about anything. Like this is partly an authority thing, right? There's a kind of a natural honoring that's supposed to go from child to parent. And so there are some instances where the most loving thing you can do is just like listen politely and not argue back, right? And not feed the and to the extent you can, try to redirect the conversation toward other stuff, right? There are other instances, though, where this is like a Christian brother or sister that you have like real relationship with. And there is a time, right, for like loving rebuke of a Christian brother. Like, I was, just meeting a couple days ago with a friend of mine at church who's my accountability partner. If one of us was getting into that, I really hope the other would say, hey, you need to chill out a little bit, right? Like you're getting your priority, because we've got a relationship where we've invited each other. Like if you see something that's off in me, I want you to speak up. I think church leaderships are going to have a kind of authority over those who are members of their congregation to try to steward this. And so there are choices church leaderships, I think, have to make to not allow people who have made politics the center of everything drive the agenda at the church. And there may be some people, like we've seen this, I'm sure you guys have probably seen this at your church too, there have been some people who have left our church because we were unwilling to make politics first. And sometimes we have to say, well, we're not going to change on this, right? I mean, we will sometimes talk about issues the Bible talks about that have political relevance. It's not like we're going to be completely silent on like pro-life or something like that. But we're also not going to let that become the agenda around which the church revolves or make politics the litmus test of like who can be a member at our church or things like that. So I would say like you always want to like err on the side of like love and gentleness in those kinds of conversations. And how much to push back often depends on the setting you're in and what type of a relationship you have with the person. Yeah.
So in Romans 13, it tells us that there's no authority except for which is instituted by God.
Right.
It seems like as Christians, it would be a good thing to urge our leaders to submit to Jesus, to obey his commands. And some people might think that might sound like, mixing state and church.
Right.
So how do we reconcile, like, we want our leaders to govern according to what God calls good.
Right.
So is our understanding of like the separation of church and state maybe different from what Scripture is teaching us about adoption?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So the question was, if passages like 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13 teach that all authority ultimately comes from God, and political authorities ultimately are answerable to God for how they use their authority, does that mean we should be encouraging those who are in positions of political authority to govern in line with God's will? And if that's true, does that actually challenge some of the like separation of church and state language that we often use? So I think what I would say is, I think all political authorities are going to have to give an account before God. But I think what they're going to give an account for is how they did in doing their job, not how they did in doing the church's job. Right? So I think the church and the government still have different jobs. Both of them are going to have to give into account, but their job descriptions are the same. Right? So from Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, We're going to learn things like governments exist to promote the public good, to punish wrongdoers, to restrain evil, right? Romans 13 doesn't bear the sword for nothing, right? We don't want violence and lawlessness to just run amok. And part of what governments exist to do is to restrain that lawlessness by punishing people who do evil, right? That would be an example. So if the government isn't doing that, right? In other words, if we see people who are committing crimes with impunity and getting away with it, I would say as Christians, we should absolutely be, one, praying, and we didn't even talk about that passage, right? Praying for our leaders, right? That we could live peaceful and quiet lives, right, is how the rest of the verse goes. Right? So pray that they would do their function of like maintaining order and promoting justice and the public good well. I think as Christians, we should absolutely pray to God that they would do that. And secondly, I think we can plead with them to do that, right? Like govern well, restrain evildoers, right? Do those things well, because you're going to have to give an account to God someday for whether you've done that well or not. I don't see governments being told in the same way the church is to go to the ends of the earth making disciples of all nations, right? So what I would say is, I think the separation between church and state is legitimate because God created both institutions and he gave them different purposes. Sometimes in culture, I think people misunderstand separation of church and state, and they try to turn it into a complete separation of religion and politics. That I don't think makes sense. People's moral beliefs are going to influence what they think the law should be, right? Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, you can't legislate morality. That's one of those like kind of half-truth things, right? What's partially true in it is really hard to enforce a law if you don't have widespread social consensus behind it. If you try to enforce a law and most people don't think it's really wrong to break the law, it doesn't work very well. I know this because I just drove here. Right? Most people don't think it's morally wrong to speed. How well does the government do in getting us all to drive the speed limit? Right? It's almost like we all kind of got together and it's like, if we all drive 5 miles an hour over, they can't arrest us all. Right? And if your friend says, you're not going to believe it, I just got a ticket coming home, are you more likely to say, oh man, that's too bad, or how dare you, right? I mean, we don't heap moral condemnation on people who get speeding tickets typically, right? So that's a picture of like a law without a social consensus behind it. And so as Christians, we should be aware of that and know that sometimes there may be things that are right, but if we haven't gotten enough social consensus behind it and we try to legislate it, we may have trouble getting the law to work very well. That's the half-truth. The misunderstanding is people saying somehow like morality and law have nothing to do with each other. That's just silly. Like when we say murder is illegal, it's because we think murder is wrong, and that's a moral judgment. When we say kidnapping is illegal, it's because kidnapping is wrong, and that's a moral judgment. So almost every law you can think of, there is a moral judgment that stands behind it. So the idea that we could like completely separate out like morality and law, religion and law, I don't think that's particularly helpful. So I would say, I think our Christian beliefs are going to help influence our understanding of ethics and morality, and that will then influence to some degree how we engage with politics. But I can agree with all of that while still seeing church and state as two separate things with separate goals. Yeah.
So we know that we as Christians are called to submit to political authority.
Yep.
And so I guess my first question is, may we become the political authority as Christians? And then if so, in light of what you
Yeah.
said, how do we balance those two offices?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So the question is, if Christians are supposed to submit to the governing authorities, can we become the governing authority? And I would say yes, right? So what I would say is, when Peter is writing to Christians in the first century, he's writing to people who are living under a dictatorship. That's what the Roman Empire was. We happen to live in a democracy, right? And so I don't think there's a prohibition that would keep a Christian from running for office. And if you win office and get elected, you're now in a position to participate in governing. What I would say, though, is you want to respect the description of the office you hold and not step beyond your office just because you're a Christian. So again, this is a pitch. Come back tomorrow morning when we talk about work and vocation. I'll talk about this a little bit more and my experience as a professor trying to do this. But I would say as a Christian is if I, as a Christian, run for office, I wouldn't see my goal primarily as how can I use the powers of my office to make people Christians? Instead, I would say, how can I use the powers of my office to fulfill God's purposes for what governments are supposed to do? Right? When we're talking about Romans 13, that means things like restraining those who do evil, commending those who do good, serving as servants of the public good, right? That's what governments are supposed to do. So I think Christians can do that. By the way, we got a whole section tomorrow morning where I'm going to be talking about Daniel, right? So if you think about Daniel, he is working as a public servant in the Babylonian Empire, for his whole career. And so I think he's a fascinating case study of someone who's in a position of significant political power, who also knows his highest allegiance is not to the king of Persia or Babylon that he's working for. Okay, maybe just one or two more. We're things are getting a little bit late here. Yeah.
I think a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about what they think about issues.
Yep.
How do I want to vote? And even between elections, this, that,
Mm-hmm.
and the other. I guess can you comment on what is actual practical action that people should be taking if they want to be involved in politics, or what extent is just drop it between elections?
Right. No, that's good. Yeah. So the question is, there's such a fixation on voting as the kind of one and only thing we do in politics, and that's something you only do every few years. So what does healthy political engagement look like other than just voting? So it can look like a lot of things. So one, remember, just because I'm saying we need to be welcoming of people whose politics differ from ours, I'm not saying you can't decide that you think God would want you to be very involved with a political party to work on a campaign or elections. People are already gearing up for presidential elections now, right? So you can do it. You can do it for a long time if you want to. That's one path, and I think Christians can take that path, right? So that some Christians are going to have politics as their livelihood. Most of us, though, aren't. So one thing I would say is, in the 2 Peter passage, nobody's thinking about voting, right? Because they couldn't do it back then. He's thinking more, how do you figure out ways to perform acts of love and good deeds in your community to make your community a better place? And I want to argue that doing things like that actually has political significance. Remember, when I was being all pessimistic before in the answer about the future of democracy, and we could reach a state where there's so little mutual trust, so few shared meanings and values, right, that things kind of fall apart. Well, what can you do to build things up on the other side? Acts of love that cut across partisan lines are one of the things that help rebuild trust. And I think there's actually something politically significant. So I would say, some of you may be I am sick and tired of reading about politics. It just makes me depressed and angry. The point of today's talk is not you have to spend all your time reading about politics. You might actually help our political system more by going out and figuring out ways to really love your neighbor. At Cornerstone and Ames, one of the things we've been trying to do is, amidst all the fights going on about public education and all that, we sometimes are asking, how can we be a blessing to our schools and our teachers, right? That's something we can do, and we're supporting a public institution, and we do it even though we don't always agree with everything they say, right? And everything that they practice. We're still trying to figure out how we can do things to be a blessing. Okay, I think last one. Yeah.
Could you speak on the difference between, I guess, political understanding of pro-life and political understanding?
Yeah. So the question is the difference between a political understanding of pro-life, and a biblical understanding of pro-life. So what I would say is a biblical understanding of pro-life, you could think of something like Psalm 139, where the psalmist is saying, like, you knit me together in my mother's womb, right? Like, before I ever entered the world, you knew who I was, right? So that's showing, like, God's concern and valuing of the fetus before it's ever entered in the world, right? So the biblical view is just affirming all human beings are created in the image of God with dignity. And we would argue, right, that you don't have to, like, emerge from the womb to already have that dignity. And that there's implications, therefore, of wanting to, like, show proper respect for the image of God as it manifests itself even in the womb. The political question has to do with what sets of laws we're going to enact to try to do that. And I mean, there's like a zillion different things that, the law has to make decisions about, like whether abortion's legal at all, if it is, under what conditions, late-term abortions, I mean, all those kinds of things. And so the political question of abortion is partly about those public policy issues and, like, different views about how to do that. And I would say, like, even Christians who agree on what I just said might come to different conclusions about how we navigate the politics of it. So here would be an example. Suppose that a bill was put forward in the legislature that would ban abortion except in cases of rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother. And suppose as a Christian, in at least some of those cases, I still think abortion should be illegal. But if we get this passed, it's going to really decrease the number of abortions. Like, some Christians are going to say, I can't vote for any legislation that allows any of these abortions I think are wrong, so I have to vote no. A different Christian might say, if I can vote for a bill that's going to, like, cut the number of abortions in half, I'm voting for it, right? Even though it's still going to be allowing. So that would be an example of people who are agreeing over here, but they may not agree on the policy. And then there's, like, a whole third level, which is how important is abortion relative to all the other issues we could be talking about? And sometimes that's a political calculation that political parties are making, right, about emphasizing some issues and de-emphasizing others. Okay, so we're hitting our time limit here of 9 o'clock. Let me, Keely, you want me to just close, or? Okay, let me close this in a word of prayer. Father, these are hard topics to work through, and they are difficult topics to work through. And I pray that you would give us humility. I know my opinions on these things are not all right, and I pray that you would help us all to be so rooted in our identity in who we are in Christ, that without fear and in love, we can show grace and hospitality to our brothers and sisters, and that you would motivate us to be agents of love and good deeds in our communities in ways that would silence those who malign the name of Christ and cause them to give honor to Jesus Christ on the day he returns. Lord, give us courage and strength and wisdom to navigate political life in these turbulent times we live in. God, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.